Okay, welcome to another video. I am on vacation for the stupid holidays, so we are actually on location today to record. All right, so this is the introduction to Module 1, and it's short. I just kind of want to frame each module with a short video because since we're not using the traditional, like, read this chapter of a textbook, sometimes the readings can be a little disjointed. You have the study guide to help you along, so that's helpful. So what is Module 1 about? Module 1 is about, the basic components of interpersonal communication and this concept of competence, which is just a general framework for thinking about your strengths and weakness as a communicator. So one of the first things you're going to cover is the relational perspective. And essentially what that means is that when you study interpersonal communication, it's not so much about how many people are involved or whether it's face-to-face. Those are things to think about. The primary issue with interpersonal is that it is an approach to communication that is relational. So in theory, you could take an interpersonal approach to group dynamics. You could take an interpersonal approach to mass media. You could take an interpersonal approach to public speaking. But the interpersonal approach stresses the relational perspective, meaning every time we engage in communication, yes, we're trying to meet instrumental needs, right? I need you to do something, so I'm explaining to you how to do it. Yes, we're meeting identity needs. I'm trying to express to you how I feel or trying to show to you my personal self. But the big thing that's missing a lot is that there's a relational need to this. And so you always have to think about that relational goal as fundamental to interpersonal communication. You're also going to learn about the 3 models of communication. And why bother learning the models and all the things that go into the models? Well, as Elise's video is going to tell you, if you have a very simple model of communication, one where you just kind of send information out and one where other people just kind of receive it, you tend to have a very one-dimensional, superficial communication behavior. And sometimes that's fine, right? If you're just trying to do an exchange at the grocery store, then you may just want a simple model of communication driving that exchange. But obviously for more important relationships, like my relationship to you or your relationship to your friends, you really need to think about all of the facets that make a model so complex. The other thing that isn't quite touched upon in this chapter, but that I want to point out, is this issue of our instincts versus the purpose or intent of our communication versus our effects. So one of the things that happens in interpersonal communication is that a lot of us are driven by instincts. We just kind of implicitly know what our communication is supposed to do, so we just do it. That doesn't usually work. I mean, for most of us, we've spent our whole life watching people communicate in very unproductive, often unhealthy ways. We've picked up a lot of bad habits. So that idea that, like, oh, I just know, or it's instinctual, it just isn't going to work for you. So if you're communicating on instinct or based on what you think is just like the way to do it, and you haven't really given it any thought or sought out any information on best practices, you're probably doing your second best type of communication. So instead of going on instinct, what I'm trying to drive you toward in this unit is to think about the purpose or intention of your communication. And that's kind of ultimately what we want, right? We want intentionality in our communication. So rather than me just sitting here and turning on this camera and just like riffing for a while without thinking about your time or your interest level or how this might be perceived on the other end or all the different places you could be while you're watching this, et cetera, if I just kind of just talk off the top of my head, I'm going to lose a lot of the connection or relationship that I could be building between the two of us if I did things like create study guides, script what I plan to say ahead of time, practice my articulation. I mean, these are all intentional, purposeful things that I'm doing to try to help facilitate our communication. That said, just because you intend for something to come across a certain way doesn't mean that that's all that matters, right? There's also this issue of effects. And one of the things we're going to talk about in this unit with this issue of competence is that your intention when you communicate never is the same as the effects of the communication. You can bring them closer together, right? So you can learn practices and practice strategies for how to make it so that the communication you intend is closer to the effects that the communication has, but you'll never close that gap. There's always going to be a gap between what you intended to happen and what could happen. So you have to remember that just because you intended for something to come across a certain way, if the effect was different, you have to think about the fact that just because you intended it doesn't mean that you're off the hook, right? So intentional communication is important, but of course you always have to then moderate and check back and self-monitor and see how your communication goes and then kind of readjust. So communication is this constant process of being intentional, trying something that you think is better than what you could have done, monitoring for effects, and then revisiting it, right? So it's a feedback loop. I have my instinct. Instead of my instinct, I try for a more intentional, purposeful communication effort. I see how that then translates in effects, and then I start over and I redo. And I keep doing this and doing this basically until I die, right? So that communication process is always circular. It's not linear, right? You're always going back to the beginning to try again. This issue of competence that we're going to talk about a lot in this chapter, that's also the subject of your first paper, is just a handy model for understanding different facets of your communication. So we're going to look at the old school model, which had 3 facets of communication. It had appropriateness, effectiveness, and ethicality. And then we're going to look at how that model has been expanded to a few more components, and we're also going to look at the model for college students. And again, they're defining college students in a very narrow sense, but it's just the newer model that includes listening and expressiveness and social relaxation and some other things that I think may work for some of you. And again, you get to choose your model. So this is the great thing about models. I'm presenting you with 3 models, the old school 3 model that's become the 6 model, and then this 4 model of college. You may not like the college one. You may be like, no, these things don't apply to me, so you have the older model to look at. No right or wrong. I still stick with that 3: appropriateness, ethicality, effectiveness. I just think for me, those are the 3 best. That 3 model is the best for me. But you can choose whichever model you want. And then one of the things you're going to notice is that there's no such thing as a perfectly competent communicator. Every person's greatest strength is also their greatest weakness, and you always have a trade-off between one aspect of competence and another. So you may be a great listener and have very low social relaxation. You may be a highly appropriate communicator, but not very effective. So you're always going to have trade-offs. And so again, your instinct right now is probably just to like enjoy the trade-offs and just deal with the fact that you're not always good at everything you want to do. So what you want to do through the studying of this unit is try to increase the things that you're not so good at while keeping your strengths, realizing that you're never going to be perfect at everything, right? You're always going to have sort of one area that's weak, but that weakness is also your greatest strength. And then the last thing I want to point out that I think the textbook does an okay job of doing, but I just want to clarify, is when we get to this issue of ethicality and competence, ethicality is not morality, right? So people will sometimes use the word morals, but ethics are human-made, they're situational, and they're negotiated. They're much more ambiguous. So for example, there's no moral attendance policy, right? So if I want to create an attendance policy for a class and I want to put it on the syllabus, there's no like moral code here, right? Morals tend to be very absolute. They're very rigid. They're usually handed down from a religious doctrine or some kind of high authority. There's a right or wrong, and they're kind of transcendental. But you would never say like my attendance policy is immoral. You would say it's unethical if, for example, I never give you any late assignments, right? It's like, okay, I can turn in grades whenever I want. So whenever I feel like giving you a grade back, I'm going to hand you a grade back, right? Could be 6 months, could not be till the end of the semester, but you have to have everything in exactly when I say, and there's no late work allowed, right? That would be kind of an unethical policy because I'm giving myself so much leeway and giving you so little leeway. So we don't have a real chance for us to be in communication. Now, in other situations, that policy may be more or less ethical, right? There are no rules. There's no guaranteed standard. So the way that like murder might be considered immoral, you can see all the ways that murder is no longer considered immoral, right? What if it's in self-defense? Right? So a moral is very strict. It's either moral or it's not, right? We don't have like kind of moral. But with ethics, we have a lot more ambiguity. So there's sort of like things can be more or less ethical according to a set of criteria, but there's no such thing as like ethical or not. It's all situated. So when we talk about communication ethicality, we're not talking about morals in like the religious or the black and white sense. We're talking about when you communicate, do you use ethicality, right? Are you transparent in your assumptions? Do you give the other person just as much of a chance to benefit from the conversation as you? Are you truthful about your intentions, right? That's what we mean by ethics. We don't really mean morals because there's really no such thing as communication morals because communication is so situated. It's so specific to the exchange with you and another person that there can't be one rule about what counts as moral communication or not, right? That would never work. So, that's it. So we have a relational perspective in this unit. You're going to learn a few models of communication that I think will be helpful. You're also going to learn the difference between your instincts, your purpose or your intention, and the effects of that intention. You'll learn more about being an intentional communicator, right? Someone who's purposeful in their communication, the trade-offs of the different aspects of competence and also the difference between communication ethicality and the concept of morality. I hope that you find this unit helpful and use the study guide as you go along, because not everything in every reading is going to be relevant.